The eternal archive stretched across 17 moons, and its crystalline towers held the memories of every species that had ever drawn breath in the known galaxy. Archivist Selen Vio had served the archive for 300 years, and in that time she had cataloged over 9 billion species. She had watched empires rise and fall through data alone. She had recorded the birth of stars and the death of gods, and yet she had never seen anything like what was about to happen. The archive was not simply a library. It was alive in ways that most beings could not understand. Its crystal matrices grew and shifted with each new piece of information. Its halls hummed with the collected wisdom of a million civilizations. On this particular cycle, Selen Vior sat in her observation chamber high above the central spire, and she reviewed the daily reports with the same careful attention she had given them for centuries. Nothing seemed unusual at first. The trade routes of the Velith Imperium showed normal activity. The Kathrani breeding cycles proceeded as expected. The border disputes between the outer systems remained exactly as boring as they had always been. Then, a young analyst named Kethra entered her chamber with a look of confusion on her face. "Archivist," Kethra said, her voice uncertain. "I found something strange while running my pattern analysis on gravitational anomalies." Selen Ver turned her attention to the young one and asked, "What kind of strange?" "There is a file that keeps appearing in my cross-references," Kethra explained. "But when I try to access it, the system tells me it is silent." Silent files were rare, so rare that most archivists went their entire careers without encountering one. They were records that had been locked not by encryption or security protocols, but by unanimous vote of the Concord of 12 Dominions. These were species deemed too primitive to matter, too dangerous to observe, or too insignificant to waste resources on. "Show me," Selen Vior commanded. Kethra projected the file designation into the air between them, and Selen Vior felt something cold move through her crystalline body when she read the words. "File Earthborn status silent, last update 12,000 cycles ago." 12,000 cycles was a long time, even by archive standards. Most silent files were reviewed every 1,000 cycles at minimum. Someone had forgotten about this one, or someone had wanted it forgotten. "Why does it keep appearing in your gravitational analysis?" Selen Vior asked. "I do not know," Kethra admitted, "but the pattern suggests that something in that system is generating unusual readings that should not exist based on the file's primitive classification." Selen Vior knew she should report this to the Concord. She knew she should follow protocol and submit a formal request for review. She knew that opening a silent file without authorization was one of the most serious violations an archivist could commit. But curiosity was a powerful force, and 300 years of cataloging other species' secrets had taught her that the most interesting discoveries often hid in the most forgotten places. She reached out with her mind and touched the file. The archive resisted at first. It sent warning after warning into her consciousness. It reminded her of her oaths and her duties. It showed her the penalties for unauthorized access. She pushed through anyway. The file opened, and Selen Vior almost laughed at what she saw. It was so thin, so pathetic, so utterly unremarkable. A small wet planet orbiting a yellow star. Tribal primates using primitive stone tools. Cave paintings and simple fire. A species that had barely learned to walk upright. The original survey team had visited 12,000 cycles ago and left a simple recommendation. Check again in 50,000 cycles, not worth observing. "This is it?" Kethra asked, disappointment clear in her voice. "This is what the gravitational anomalies led us to?" Selen Vior was about to close the file and forget it ever existed when the archive did something impossible. It shuddered. The crystalline walls around them vibrated with a frequency that Selen Vior had never felt before. The lights flickered. The data streams that flowed through every surface began to twist and spiral in chaotic patterns. "What is happening?" Kethra cried out in alarm. Selenvire watched in horror as new data began flooding into the Earthborn file data that no one had submitted. Data that no survey team had collected. Data that the archive was somehow generating on its own. The file grew thicker with each passing moment. Images and recordings and scientific measurements poured in from nowhere. The thin record of primitive primates expanded into something massive and terrifying. "The archive is updating itself," Selenvire whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. "But that is not possible. The archive only records what is submitted to it. It cannot create information." But the evidence was right in front of her eyes. 12,000 years of history wrote itself into existence. 12,000 years that no one had witnessed. 12,000 years that the Concord had chosen to ignore. Kethra grabbed Selenvire's arm and asked, "Should we stop it? Should we close the file?" "I do not think we can," Selenvire replied. The updates continued for what felt like an eternity. When they finally stopped, the Earthborn file had grown from a few pages to millions of records. It now contained more data than some spacefaring civilizations. Selenvire opened the first of the new entries with trembling hands, and what she saw made her ancient heart freeze. The primates had changed. They were no longer simple creatures huddling around fires. They had built cities that reached into the sky. They had created machines that thought for themselves. They had split the atom and touched the stars. How is this possible? Kethra demanded. No species evolves this fast. The Kathrani took 200,000 cycles to achieve spaceflight. The Velith needed 90,000 cycles and 3 extinction events. Selenvire scrolled through the records, each one more impossible than the last. She saw the Earthborn wage wars against themselves. She saw them build weapons that could crack planets. She saw them stand on the edge of total destruction again and again. And then she saw them survive. Every time they came close to ending themselves, they pulled back. Every time they faced extinction, they found a way forward. They were messy and violent and chaotic, but they refused to die. The most recent update showed their current status, and Selenvire felt true fear for the first time in centuries. The Earthborn had sent machines beyond their own star system. They were reaching into the void. They were looking for others. "They are looking for us," Selenvire realized. Kethris asked the question that hung heavy in the air between them. "What do we do now?" Selenvire knew she had to report this to the Concord. The 12 Dominions needed to know that a species they had forgotten had somehow become something extraordinary. They needed to know that the archive itself had broken its own rules to show them what they had missed. But first, she needed to understand why this had happened. Why had the archive updated without authorization? What was so special about these Earthborn that even the living memory of the galaxy could not ignore them? She dove deeper into the files, searching for answers, and what she found would change everything the Concord believed about the nature of intelligent life. The Earthborn were coming, whether the galaxy was ready for them or not, and the archive had just announced their arrival to anyone wise enough to listen. The Concord of 12 Dominions had governed the known galaxy for over 2 million cycles, and in all that time, the Eternal Archive had never once made an error. It could not lie because it was built to record only truth. It could not fabricate because it had no imagination. It could only show what was real, what had happened, what existed in the cold, hard fabric of reality. So when Selenvire brought her findings before the assembled delegates, she expected shock and concern. What she got instead was denial and anger. "This is corruption," declared High Councilor Vethmaran of the Velith Imperium, his massive scaled form rising from his seat. "Pure and simple data corruption. The archive has somehow been infected with false information. Selenvar shook her head and replied, I ran every diagnostic protocol we have. The data is genuine. The archive verified it 17 times before I came here. Then someone submitted false records, suggested Ambassador Carol of the Kathrani Collective, her insectoid eyes clicking with suspicion. Perhaps this is sabotage from one of the outer systems. No one submitted anything. Selenvar explained for the third time. The archive updated itself. It pulled information from sources we cannot identify. It recorded 12,000 cycles of history that we never witnessed. The chamber erupted in arguments and accusations. Delegates shouted at each other across the vast space. Some demanded investigations, while others called for the entire Earthborn file to be deleted and forgotten. Only Elder Morvax of the Velith remained silent, his ancient eyes fixed on the data projections that floated above the central platform. He was the oldest member of the Concord, and he had seen more than most could imagine. When the noise finally died down, Morvax spoke in a voice like grinding stone. Show us the timeline. Show us exactly what these Earthborn have accomplished. Selenvar activated the projection, and the room fell silent. The display started 12,000 cycles ago with primitive humans huddled in caves. Their tools were simple rocks and sticks. Their greatest achievement was controlling fire. They were prey as often as they were predators. Then the timeline began to accelerate. In just a few thousand cycles, they developed agriculture and built permanent settlements. They created writing and mathematics. They formed kingdoms and empires that rose and fell like waves on a shore. The delegates watched in disbelief as the Earthborn invented metalworking, then machinery, then electricity. They saw humans create vehicles that moved without animals. They saw them build towers of glass and steel that scraped the sky. This must be compressed time, Ambassador Caril insisted. They cannot have done all this in such a short period. The timeline is accurate, Selenvar confirmed. Every cycle is accounted for. Every advancement is documented. The projection continued, and the impossible became even more impossible. The Earthborn split the atom in what they called the 20th century. They built weapons capable of destroying their entire civilization. They pointed these weapons at each other and came within moments of total annihilation. They should have ended here, High Counselor Vethmaran observed. Every other species that developed such weapons destroyed themselves within a generation. But the Earthborn did not destroy themselves. They pulled back from the edge. They chose to survive. And then they reached for the stars. The projection showed their first primitive rockets. It showed their astronauts floating in the void. It showed them landing on their own moon just a few hundred cycles after they had learned to fly. 400 cycles, Elder Morvax said slowly. They went from their first powered flight to walking on their moon in 400 cycles. The number hung in the air like a curse. The Kathrani had taken 200,000 cycles to achieve spaceflight. They were considered one of the faster developing species in the galaxy. The Velith had needed 90,000 cycles and 3 separate extinction events before they finally reached the stars. 400 cycles was not evolution. It was something else entirely. Perhaps they had help, suggested one of the minor delegates. Perhaps another species interfered with their development. Selenvar had already checked that possibility and shook her head. There is no evidence of outside contact. No other species has visited their system since the original survey. They did this completely on their own. The projection continued to show humanity's progress. Their probes reached the outer planets of their system. Their telescopes peered into the depths of space. Their radio signals spread outward in an ever-expanding sphere. They are looking for us, Kethra said quietly from her position behind Selenvar. Every one of those signals is a question. They want to know if anyone else exists. High Counselor Vethmoran laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Let them look. The void is vast. They will search for thousands of cycles before they find anything. Actually, Selenvior interrupted. They have already detected our observation satellites. The chamber went completely silent. What did you say? Elder Morvax asked, his voice deadly calm. The most recent archive update shows that Earthborn scientists identified unusual objects near the edge of their system. Selenvior explained, objects that do not match any natural phenomenon. Objects that we placed there 12,000 cycles ago when we first marked them as silent. The implications crashed through the room like a physical force. The Concord had always believed they could observe without being observed. They had always assumed that primitive species would never notice the subtle signs of their presence. They had always thought themselves invisible. But the Earthborn had looked up and seen something that did not belong, and now they knew they were not alone. We need to destroy those satellites immediately, Ambassador Carell demanded. We need to remove all evidence of our presence. It is too late, Selenvior replied. They have already recorded the data. Destroying the satellites now would only confirm their suspicions. Elder Morvax rose from his seat, and everyone in the chamber turned to face him. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of 2 million cycles of wisdom. We made a choice 12,000 cycles ago to ignore these Earthborn. We marked them silent because we thought they were insignificant. We forgot about them and assumed they would remain primitive forever. He paused and looked at the projection, which now showed Earth as it currently existed, a world of 7 billion. Humans with technology that advanced faster with each passing year. We were wrong, Morvax admitted. We were so very wrong. And now we must decide what to do about our mistake. The question hung in the air, and no one had an answer. The Earthborn had done something that should have been impossible. They had evolved from stone tools to space travel in the blink of a cosmic eye. They had survived wars and plagues and disasters that should have ended them 100 times over. And now they were reaching out into the dark, searching for whoever might be listening. The galaxy had ignored them for 12,000 cycles, but the archive itself had decided that the silence must end. It had updated without authorization because even a living crystalline intelligence could not pretend that humanity did not matter. The Earthborn were coming, and the Concord needed to decide whether to welcome them or fear them, or perhaps both. Elder Morvax had lived for over 50,000 cycles, and in all that time he had learned one truth above all others. The past always held secrets that the present needed to understand. While the other delegates argued about what to do with the Earthborn situation, Morvax retreated to the deepest levels of the Eternal Archive. Down here, in chambers carved from the original crystal that had seeded the entire structure, the oldest records were kept. He searched through files that had not been accessed in millennia. He dug through layers of history that most beings had forgotten existed. He looked for the original deliberation records from when Earth was first marked silent. What he found changed everything he thought he knew about humanity. The original survey team had arrived on Earth during what the natives called an ice age. Massive glaciers covered much of the planet. Temperatures dropped so low that survival was a daily battle. Food was scarce and death was common. The team had been led by a Veloth philosopher named Ermcasseth, and his observations were recorded in precise detail. Morvax read through page after page of scientific data about the primitive humans. He learned about their physical characteristics, their social structures, their hunting methods. But one observation stood apart from all the others. Ermcasseth had watched 2 tribes encounter each other on a frozen plain. Both groups were starving. Both had lost members to the cold. Both were desperate and afraid. Every model of evolutionary behavior predicted what would happen next. When resources were scarce and survival was uncertain, species fought. They competed. The strong eliminated the weak. It was the fundamental law of nature across every world the Concord had ever studied. But the humans did something unexpected. Instead of fighting, the leaders of both tribes approached each other. Instead of competing, they began to communicate. Instead of trying to eliminate a rival, they sat down together. And then one tribe shared its fire with the other. Morvax read Erncasith's words with growing wonder. I have cataloged over 3,000 species in my career, and I have never witnessed anything like this. These creatures were dying. Their survival depended on conserving every resource. Sharing with strangers should have been impossible. The observation continued, yet they did it anyway. They chose connection over competition. They chose kindness over survival. This is not rational behavior. This is not evolution. This is something I cannot explain. Erncasith had brought his findings back to the Concord, and the debate had been fierce. Some delegates had wanted to study the humans more closely. They saw potential in a species that could override its own survival instincts. They argued that such beings might become valuable allies someday. But others were afraid. A species that does not follow predictable patterns is dangerous. One ancient record showed a Kathrani delegate arguing, "We cannot model their behavior. We cannot anticipate their decisions. We cannot control what we cannot understand." The vote had been close, but fear won in the end. Erncasith himself had written the final recommendation. They possess something we have never cataloged. When faced with extinction, they did not calculate survival. They chose kinship with strangers. This is not evolution. This is something else. Something the archive cannot quantify. Silence them. Let them grow unwatched. Or do not let them grow at all. The Concord had chosen silence, and for 12,000 cycles, they had kept their distance. Morvax sat alone in the ancient chamber and thought about what he had learned. The Earthborn had not been silenced because they were primitive. They had been silenced because they were unpredictable. They had been silenced because they showed compassion when logic demanded cruelty. And now they had proven just how unpredictable they could be. In 12,000 cycles, they had faced ice ages and plagues and wars. They had invented weapons that could destroy their world. They had stood on the edge of extinction more times than any species should survive. But every time they fell, they helped each other back up. Every time they faced the end, they chose to face it together. The same trait that had frightened Erncasith 12,000 cycles ago had carried them all the way to the stars. Morvax returned to the council chamber with the ancient records, and when he shared what he had found, even the most stubborn delegates fell silent. They were not marked silent because they were insignificant, Morvax explained. They were marked silent because we could not predict them. Because they did not follow the rules that every other species follows. High Counselor Vethmoran studied the records with narrowed eyes and asked, "You are saying we were afraid of them, even when they were primitives living in caves?" "Not afraid," Morvax corrected. "Confused. Our models could not explain why they would share resources with strangers. Our predictions could not account for kindness in the face of extinction. We did not understand them, so we chose not to watch." Ambassador Carroll made a clicking sound of frustration. "And now they have grown beyond our understanding entirely. Wonderful. We ignored a problem until it became a crisis." "Is it a crisis?" Kethrisa asked from her position beside Selenvior. "They have not attacked anyone. They have not threatened anyone. All they have done is reach out and ask if anyone else exists." The question sparked another round of arguments. Some delegates insisted that the Earthborn were dangerous. A species that could not be predicted, could not be trusted. They might be friendly today and hostile tomorrow. The only safe choice was to contain them before they spread further. Others argued for caution. Humanity had not shown any aggressive intent toward the wider galaxy. Perhaps they could be approached carefully. Perhaps they could be guided toward becoming responsible members of the interstellar community. But Selenvior had been studying the Earthborn records while the others debated, and what she found complicated everything. "They know about conflict," she announced. "They have fought more wars among themselves than most species fight in their entire existence. They have committed terrible acts of cruelty. They have done things that would horrify any member of this council." The delegates who favored containment looked vindicated. But, Selenvior continued, they also remember those acts. They teach their children about the horrors of war. They build monuments to their own failures. They study their worst moments specifically so they will not repeat them. She projected images from Earth, memorials to fallen soldiers, museums dedicated to atrocities, educational programs designed to prevent future conflicts. They do not hide from their darkness, Selenvior observed. They face it. They acknowledge it. They use it to make themselves better. How many species can say the same? The chamber fell silent as the delegates considered her words. Every civilization had shameful moments in its past. Every species had committed acts they would rather forget. But most chose to bury those memories. Most preferred to pretend that only their achievements mattered. The Earthborn refused to forget. They refused to pretend. They looked at their worst selves and decided to be better. Elder Morvax nodded slowly and said, "Ernkaseth was right all those cycles ago. They possess something we have never cataloged. Something the archive cannot quantify. What do we call it?" High Counselor Vethmoran asked. Morvax thought for a long moment before answering. The Earthborn have a word for it. They call it hope. The belief that tomorrow can be better than today. The faith that struggling matters even when victory is uncertain. He paused and looked around the chamber at delegates who had governed the galaxy for millions of cycles. We have forgotten what that feels like. Perhaps it is time we remembered. The silence stretched on as the Concord contemplated a species that should not exist. That should not have survived. That should not have reached the stars, but had done all three through nothing more than stubborn refusal to give up. The signal came from Earth on what the humans called a Tuesday, though the Concord had no word for such divisions of time. Selenvior was the first to detect it. She had been monitoring the Earthborn system constantly since the unauthorized archive update. She had watched their satellites and listened to their broadcasts. She had learned more about humanity in a few cycles than the original survey team had discovered in years. When the signal arrived, she almost missed it. It was so simple, so basic, so unlike the complex communications that advanced species typically used. It was mathematics. The Earthborn had broadcast a sequence of prime numbers toward the exact location where they had detected the Concord observation satellites. They had sent the universal language of intelligence. They had asked the simplest possible question: is anyone there? Selenvior called an emergency session of the Concord, and by the time all delegates had assembled, she had already analyzed the signal in complete detail. "It is not a greeting," she reported. "It is not a declaration of peace or a warning of war. It is simply a question. They want to know if we exist." Ambassador Carol made a dismissive clicking sound. "They send questions into the void like children throwing stones into a well. Do they expect an answer?" "They hope for one," Selenvior replied, "but they do not expect it. I have studied their history of searching for intelligent life. They call it SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. They have been looking for over 100 of their years. And they found nothing?" High Counselor Vethmoran asked. "They found silence," Selenvior confirmed. "Every signal they sent vanished without response. Every search came back empty. By all logic, they should have given up decades ago. But they did not give up," Elder Morvax observed. "No. They kept searching. They kept sending. They kept hoping. Kethra had been studying the Earthborn cultural database, and she stepped forward to share her findings. I have analyzed their literature and their stories, their myths and their dreams. I found something interesting. She activated a projection that showed various human narratives, tales of explorers and adventurers, stories of people who faced impossible odds. Their heroes are not always victorious, Kethra explained. Many of their most celebrated figures failed in their goals. They died before seeing their dreams realized. They suffered and lost and fell short of their ambitions. Then, why celebrate them? Ambassador Carol demanded, what is the point of honoring failure? Because the Earthborn do not measure worth by success alone. Kethra answered, they believe that the attempt matters. They believe that trying is valuable, even when winning is impossible. They have built their entire civilization on the idea that struggling towards something beautiful is itself beautiful. The delegates exchanged uncomfortable glances. In Concord space, failure was shameful. Species rose or fell based on their achievements. Those who could not succeed were forgotten while those who triumphed were remembered. The Earthborn had inverted that entire philosophy. They remembered those who tried. They honored those who reached for something greater, even when they fell short. This explains their signal, Elder Morvax realized. They know the odds of receiving a response are tiny. They know they might search forever and find nothing. But they send the signal anyway, because the act of reaching out has meaning to them. Selenvar nodded and added, there is a phrase that appears throughout their culture. They say, if at first you do not succeed, try again. They treat failure not as an end, but as a step toward eventual success. That is either inspiring or insane. High Counselor Vethmaran muttered. Perhaps it is both, Morvax replied with what might have been a smile. The debate continued for several cycles. Some delegates wanted to respond to the signal immediately. Others wanted to maintain silence and continue observation. A few still argued for containing humanity before they could expand further. But the archive was not finished surprising them. During a particularly heated argument about response protocols, the crystalline walls of the council chamber began to glow. The same phenomenon that had preceded the unauthorized update was happening again. A new file appeared in the central projection, a file that had never existed before. It bore a title that sent chills through every delegate present. Projection Earthborn Next 1000 Cycles. The archive is attempting to predict their future, Selenvio realized. Every delegate leaned forward. The archive's predictive capabilities were legendary. It could model the development of civilizations with remarkable accuracy. It had predicted the rise and fall of empires, the outcomes of wars, the paths of species toward advancement or extinction. The file opened, and the chamber went silent. It was empty. Not corrupted, not restricted, not awaiting data, simply empty. The archive had attempted to project humanity's future and had produced nothing. What does this mean? Ambassador Carell demanded. Selenvior ran diagnostic after diagnostic. She checked the archive's processing matrices. She verified its prediction algorithms. Everything was functioning perfectly. The archive was not broken. It means the archive cannot predict them, she finally admitted. It has enough data to project the future of any species in the galaxy. But when it tries to model the Earthborn, it produces nothing. That is impossible, High Counselor Vethmaran insisted. The archive has predicted civilizations with far less data. Data is not the problem, Selenvior explained. The problem is that the Earthborn do not follow predictable patterns. They make choices that defy statistical modeling. They change direction based on factors that our algorithms cannot account for. Elder Morvax understood. They have free will in a way that other species do not. We follow logical paths. We make decisions based on calculable factors. They choose based on emotion, on hope, on stubborn refusal to accept inevitable outcomes. So we cannot predict what they will do? Ambassador Carell asked, her voice carrying an edge of fear. Correct. We do not know if they will become peaceful explorers or aggressive conquerors. We do not know if they will unite their species or tear themselves apart. We do not know if they will be friends or enemies. Then how do we decide how to treat them? High Counselor Vethmoran demanded. The question echoed through the chamber, and no one had an answer. For millions of cycles, the Concord had made decisions based on predictions. They knew which species would be valuable allies. They knew which would become threats. They planned their responses centuries in advance. With humanity, they were blind. They could not see the future. They could not calculate the optimal strategy. They had to make a choice based on nothing more than instinct and judgment. The signal from Earth continued to broadcast. Is anyone there? Is anyone there? The question repeated over and over, patient and hopeful. They are waiting for us, Kethra said softly. They do not know if we exist. They do not know if we are friendly. They do not know what we will do. But they reached out anyway, because that is who they are. Elder Morvax looked at the empty prediction file, then at the signal display, then at his fellow delegates. Perhaps, he said slowly, that is exactly what we should do. Perhaps we should stop trying to calculate and predict. Perhaps we should simply answer their question. The chamber erupted in protest and support in equal measure, but Morvax held up a hand for silence. They asked if anyone is there. After 12,000 cycles of silence, after we ignored them and forgot them, after we let them struggle alone against extinction time after time, they still reached out. They still hoped. They still believed that the universe might contain friends they had not yet met. He paused and let his words sink in. The least we can do is tell them they were right. The debate lasted for 30 cycles, and in all that time the signal from Earth never stopped. Every few hours, the Earthborn broadcast their message of mathematics toward the stars. They sent their question into the void over and over. Is anyone there? Is anyone there? Patient and persistent and full of quiet hope. The Concord delegates argued endlessly about what to do. High Counselor Vethmoran led the faction that demanded caution. We cannot predict their behavior. We cannot model their decisions. How can we possibly trust a species we do not understand? Ambassador Carell went further and demanded quarantine. They are too unpredictable to be allowed into the wider galaxy. We should surround their system with observation posts and prevent them from expanding. It is the only safe choice. But Elder Morvax pushed back against both positions. We have spent 30 cycles discussing what we should do to them. Perhaps we should ask what they might do for us. What could primitives possibly offer the Concord? Vethmoran scoffed. Fresh perspective, Morvax replied. New ideas. Ways of thinking that we abandoned millions of cycles ago. We have become so focused on prediction and control that we have forgotten what it means to take risks. Selenvire had continued her research throughout the debate, and she had discovered something remarkable in the Earthborn records. She waited for the right moment to share it. May I present additional findings? She asked during a lull in the arguments. The delegates nodded their permission, and Selenvire activated a new projection. I have been studying how the Earthborn handle disagreements, she explained. When they face difficult decisions, they do not always seek consensus. They do not always wait until everyone agrees. That sounds like chaos, Ambassador Carell observed. It is, Selenvire agreed, but it is productive chaos. They have a process they call democracy. They discuss and debate, and then they vote. The majority decides, and the minority accepts the decision. Then they move forward together, even if some believe the decision is wrong? Vethmoran asked. Even then? They understand that perfect agreement is impossible. They accept that sometimes they will be wrong. But they believe that moving forward imperfectly is better than remaining frozen in endless debate. The implication was clear. The Concorde had been debating for 30 cycles, while humanity continued to reach out. They had analyzed and discussed and argued while the signal kept broadcasting. Perhaps it was time to stop talking and start acting. Elder Morvax rose from his seat and addressed the assembly. Archivist Selenvior is correct. We have deliberated long enough. I call for a vote. On what specific question? High Counselor Vethmoran demanded. Morvax considered for a moment before answering. On whether to change the Earthborn classification from silent to active. On whether to acknowledge their existence and begin the process of first contact. The chamber buzzed with nervous energy. First contact was not taken lightly. It meant centuries of careful diplomacy. It meant sharing technology and culture and resources. It meant bringing a new species into the family of intelligent life. With a predictable species, the Concorde could plan every step in advance. They could model outcomes and prepare for contingencies. They could control the process from beginning to end. With humanity, they would be flying blind. One by one, the delegates cast their votes. The Kathrani Collective voted against. Ambassador Corral maintained that unpredictable species were too dangerous to engage. The Velith Imperium was split. High Counselor Vethmoran voted against, but several of his own delegates broke ranks and voted in favor. The smaller dominions were divided as well. Some saw opportunity in humanity's chaotic energy. Others saw only risk. When the final count was tallied, the result was closer than anyone had expected. 7 in favor, 5 against. The Earthborn classification would be changed. Selenvior felt a mixture of excitement and fear as she prepared the official amendment. She had started this entire situation by opening a file she should not have touched. Now she was changing the course of galactic history. She entered the new information into the archive. File Earthborn status active classification. Pending note. This species has demonstrated adaptive resilience beyond statistical modeling. They respond to extinction-level events with innovation. They respond to isolation with connection. They respond to silence with signal. Recommendation: do not underestimate. The archive accepted the update, and for a moment, everything was still. Then the crystalline walls began to glow again. The familiar sensation of unauthorized access rippled through the chamber. The archive was adding something on its own. Addendum: unauthorized, source unknown. They are still looking for us. Perhaps it is time we answered. The delegates stared at the words in stunned silence. Did the archive just express an opinion? Kethra whispered. It should not be possible, Selenvi replied. The archive records facts. It does not make suggestions. It does not have preferences. But there the words were, glowing softly in the ancient crystal. Perhaps it is time we answered. Elder Morvax began to laugh, a deep, rumbling sound that echoed through the chamber. The other delegates looked at him in confusion. Do you not see? He asked between laughs. The archive has been around since before any of our species achieved spaceflight. It has recorded the rise and fall of countless civilizations. It has watched empires grow and crumble. And in all that time, it has never once expressed an opinion. He gestured at the glowing addendum. But the Earthborn were so remarkable, so unprecedented, so utterly unlike anything it had ever recorded, that even the archive itself felt compelled to comment. The laughter spread through the chamber as the truth of his words sank in. A living machine that had maintained perfect neutrality for millions of cycles had finally encountered something that moved it. Humanity had inspired an opinion in a being that had never before needed to form one. Very well, High Counselor Vethmoran said. his voice carrying resignation and perhaps a hint of amusement. If even the archive believes we should answer, who am I to argue? We should compose a response immediately, Ambassador Carryle added. If we are going to do this, we should do it properly. The delegates began discussing what to say, how to introduce themselves, how to explain where they had been for 12,000 cycles, how to apologize for the long silence. But Selenvire was not listening. She was watching the Earthborn signal as it continued to broadcast. Is anyone there? Is anyone there? She thought about a small blue planet spinning in the darkness. She thought about 7 billion beings who had fought their way up from caves and ice ages. She thought about a species that had split atoms and walked on moons and still found time to wonder if they were alone. They had suffered so much. They had nearly destroyed themselves so many times. But they had never stopped reaching out. They had never stopped hoping. And now their hope was about to be rewarded. The Concord would send a response. It would take time for the message to travel. It would take longer for diplomacy to unfold. But eventually, someday, humanity would know the truth. They were not alone. They had never been alone. The galaxy had been watching, even when it pretended not to. And now the watching was finally over. Far below, on a small wet world orbiting a yellow star, a child looked up at the night sky. She did not know that signals were racing toward her planet. She did not know that ancient beings were debating her species' fate. She only knew that the stars were beautiful and that she wanted to touch them someday. She made a wish on a falling star, the way children had done for thousands of years. She wished for adventure. She wished for discovery. She wished for friends she had not yet met. And somewhere in the vast archive, a crystalline intelligence recorded her wish alongside the hopes and dreams of every human who had ever looked up at the sky and wondered. The file on Earthborn grew by one more entry. Another small moment of human wonder. Another piece of the puzzle that even the most advanced minds in the galaxy could not solve. They were not special because they were strong. They were not remarkable because they were smart. They were extraordinary because they refused to give up. Because they helped each other when logic demanded selfishness. Because they hoped when hope made no sense. The galaxy had tried to forget them. The archive had tried to predict them. The Concord had tried to understand them. In the end, all anyone could do was answer their question. Is anyone there? Yes, we are here. We have always been here. And we are so very glad you kept asking.